All right, what's up, everybody? I am here with Aaron Rabinowitz. We spoke some time ago, it was a few months back, about meta ethics over on your podcast, Embrace the Void. I'll give a link in the description for that, so you could go check that out. And you had invited me to talk about moral luck, so that's what we're here to do. And I guess the last thing I'll say, I'll turn it over to you. Is as far as I know, you recently finished your PhD. So congrats on that. I went through that whole process a couple of years ago, so it's a tough road. Everybody's got their story about the trials and tribulations they had to go through. So that in and of itself could probably be an interesting discussion at some point. But let me turn it over to you. Tell us about who you are, what you do, and let's get into talking about moral luck.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. And yeah, I'm going to talk about luck real broadly, but we can we'll start out with moral luck and see how we get to luck in general. But yeah, thanks for the shout out on the dissertation. I still have my minor revisions to do, but I'm technically a doctor now, apparently. And it's weird. I don't know what your experience was like. Certainly, you hear about like all of the horrors along the way, and you hear about the horrors of the job market afterwards. But there was a little bit less discussion of the kind of psychological crash that comes after you complete the dissertation, where you're sort of in this weird liminal space for a second, and like you've been doing this thing for so long, and that like it's hard to not get totally derailed in that moment. I feel like. I don't know if you had a
That
similar experience.
Absolutely. I didn't just have burnout because I read so much, I wrote so much. There were days where I remember waking up writing and I forget to have coffee, forget to have breakfast, because I was just in this like writing flow zone where I just wake up and get to it. And then it'd be like noon or 2 p.m. and I'm like, all right, I got to get up and do something other than write. And after that sort of a dash towards the finish line, uh,
Hmm.
and once everything was out of the way and I knew I was done, there's this weird empty void that I felt. Like everything I was reading, everything I was thinking was this for in my case years. Uh,
Yeah.
and it's been strange since then. I've actually struggled to read books and articles since then with the same level of focus.
I've had the same experience of like I stopped listening to podcasts and basically reading or listening to books that weren't anything about like we're gonna be part of the dissertation about a year away from like having finished it. So like a year ago now that and I'm having a really hard time picking them back up. And it's a feeling of like I don't really want other people's voices in my head at the moment. And it's like I was trying to keep this very big, very delicate argument balanced in my head for so long. And now it's like I'm not sure what I want in there at the moment instead or something. I don't know. It's a very weird feeling. But I'm at least lucky in that I really love my topic. And so I'm happy to like go talk about it with folks. And I did a series on my show, sort of going through each of the chapters. But sorry, one second. There is some ridiculous thing going on outside. I apologize. So I've been obsessed with this topic for going on 15 years now. I started out in philosophy in undergrad. I was originally a theater person who found out that philosophy was something living people still do, and then got really into ethics. I really loved ethical hypotheticals and sort of the complexities, and also the way that it was really important to our daily lives, that we're all doing ethics all the time. And then in my master's program, I got particularly obsessed with the issue of moral luck because of a piece by Thomas Nagel called Moral Luck, where he lays out kind of the core of my view, what I call luck pilling, which is sort of convincing everyone of the taboo truth that everything is luck all the way down, and then helping them internalize that truth in a way that isn't harmful.
Yeah, it's interesting that the luck pilling. You're not going to need to do that with me because that was something I became convinced of, I guess, on my own. I don't know if I had read Nagel or what I read as an undergrad that exposed me to these ideas, but we're on the same page at least there. So I don't think I wouldn't be able to give you like sincere, like you're wrong about this. I would like to know what that looks like. Have you had debates with people about this where they really disagree with you? I would
Oh
imagine
yeah,
a lot of
lots of
people do.
times.
Okay,
Yes.
cool.
And I certainly, every time I give a talk, I have somebody who comes up to me afterwards and confesses that they've believed this their entire lives and were either afraid to say anything or said something and got shouted down a lot. So that's why I do genuinely think this is a pretty taboo view. But I also think there are a fair number of people who hold it because the arguments for it, I think, are sound, and it's very hard to ignore them. Um, but there are people who will object to it on a variety of fronts. And so my dissertation is ridiculously large and interdisciplinary because essentially I have to go through philosophy of luck, psychology of luck, and politics of luck to lay out the kinds of objections and the implications in each of those different domains in order to make the argument that it is true and important to teach children that everything is luck all the way down. Because that is a much stronger claim than just I personally believe that everything is luck all the way down. It's, for example, in the politics section, I had to include a whole part where I explained that what I'm doing is not illiberal indoctrination, just because I think that we should tell kids everything is luck and not maybe everything is luck, figure it out for yourself.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the ways in which people frame the philosophical positions, there's this sense of like, oh, well, this is my position and other people have their positions, and hey, we all have our different positions. But when you think that there are immediate, direct, practical implications to people adopting a belief, it becomes kind of important to say, hey, I'm not just arguing this is true. I kind of think this is important for us to inculcate in ourselves and internalize as the truth, because there are consequences to this and it matters whether people believe this. I often think that's not true about a lot of the views I defend, where I'm like, it doesn't really matter that much. But this one, I
Right.
do think it would matter. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and, like, I'm all for, thought puzzles and spherical cows and whatnot. I had a metaphysics teacher who was maybe one of the best teachers I ever had because he could make metaphysics interesting. Like,
Hmm.
I took the easy job. All I have to do is make ethics interesting, which is, almost everyone is interested in ethics instantly. So I do like I think this has real world applications, and that's one of the things that really draws me to it, and it's why I'm very thankful that my PhD is actually in education and not philosophy. Even though that means that I'm vastly less employable, it does mean that I got to spend years reading a bunch of psychology and political theory and other things that wouldn't have shown up in the philosophy departments that I was going to go to. And like there is a reason that I think is bad for philosophers, is because, like you said, it cuts them off from the research, the data. So someone had a great comment up on Blue Sky the other day that, like, philosophers, like, being a philosopher probably changes the way you think about words and concepts, and yet philosophers really comfortably just kind of assume a lot of the time that they understand how people use concepts based on their own personal analysis of that concept. But if you go out into the world and, like, look at how people use the concept of luck and use the concept of free will, it really should shape how whether you debate, like, on the side of we should try to preserve this concept or we should try to
Mhm.
help people get rid of this concept. So I was lucky that I got to look at the psychology stuff. The psychology stuff really motivated me a lot in this, um, because essentially for the first, before the PhD, I believed Nagel's argument. Like, I was convinced, like you were, of Nagel's argument, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what the alternative was. I didn't know how to make the case for the alternative. There were, all of these big question marks for me. So I just kept teaching it to students who were really interested in it and doing the best I could to kind of give them a better direction to go in once they've had these thoughts. But it wasn't until I got into the psych research about attribution theory and the way that human beings explain the causes of events, and when they attribute things to luck, it has certain implications for their behaviors, and a lot of our positive psychology has arisen out of attempts to deny the prevalence of luck in our lives, essentially. And then I discovered this cluster of what I call the just world illusion cluster, this cluster of illusions, these deeply held needs to believe that the world is just, that we have free will, that the world is meritocratic, and that, like, there's some kind of divine or cosmic justice. Those needs, I realized, were at the heart of the resistance that you mentioned and that I've talked about as being a common response to these arguments. That often when people are resisting this, what they are afraid of is that they're going to lose primarily their just world illusion.
Well, okay, so there's so much. I was worried. I was like, what am I going to ask about? But as soon as you bring up the psychology, there's a lot to go with on that. But before we get into to all of that, can you
Hmm.
give us an overview of what moral luck is? So, like,
Sure.
maybe whatever would help. Because I'm sure you
Yeah,
have
I
to teach
know.
this to people. How would you teach people about this that are not previously familiar with it?
Right. And like the way I organize the dissertation is I start with the philosophy of luck and I lay out the different accounts of luck like a good philosopher, lay out all the different definitions, explain why I think one particular definition is the right one, and then explain the implications for it in terms of this moral luck problem. So to get us there, I think, first I'll just say within the philosophy world, there are three main accounts of luck and then a bunch of subsidiary accounts. But your main accounts of luck are going to be the chance account of luck, the modal account of luck, and the lack of control account of luck. There is also a feature, I would argue, that all things that are luck have, which is it's called the significance condition. So for something to be lucky, it has to be significant to someone. But I think that it's a criteria that's met by literally everything because everything in the world is significant to someone in the right kind of way here. So it's a fairly trivial condition. The major debate is over whether luck is tied to the condition either in the chance account. You have a couple of different versions, things like something is lucky if it's improbable, unpredictable, indeterminate, unlikely, very rare. There's also a separate weird chance account of luck that just collapses into the lack of control account. For the sake of our not having too much time, I'm going to breeze through like a bunch of 50 pages of errata here. The modal account is a very philosophically technical account, but I don't think actually brings anything significantly new to the table. It's all about modal fragility with regard to possible worlds. So it ties into the counterfactual thinking that often comes up when we think about luck in the sense of like, oh, I almost died, meaning in most of the nearby possible worlds, I did die from that thing. And in this world, I happen to be lucky enough and I didn't die. Um, I think that account just collapses into the other accounts essentially. It doesn't provide any unique new insights on the issue. The account that I think is correct, and this again comes originally from Nagel, is the quote unquote lack of control, but I'm just going to call it the control account of luck, which is luck is things that are not under your control in the right kind of way. So a lot of the debate around the control account is if we accept this, what do we mean by control here? The more deflated account of a control you have, the more likely it is that people can have responsibility. That there are things in the world that aren't luck, essentially, right? There are things that we have control over. Whereas folks like myself argue that the kind of control that you would need in order to have something not count as luck and therefore be something that you could be responsible for is so extreme that nobody has it. And therefore nobody has free will, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially we distinguish between the kind of causal control that I have when I pick up my glass and take a drink, which we all recognize that we have, and the kind of other control that we recognize that's different from that, that's necessary for me to be responsible in such a way, what we call moral responsibility, where I deserve the outcomes of my actions. I deserve punishment or blame. These things come apart, we know, because the example I always give is a kid gets a hold of a gun, shoots another kid. Um, Causally, he pulled the trigger, right? He did kill the other child, but we would not view him as responsible for doing so because he didn't understand the consequences of his actions if he's young enough, etc. So it's very clear in that situation that moral responsibility and causal, control come apart in this kind of way. And then the argument just goes, that's true for all cases, for everything. We're all a version of that child with that gun. And then I lay that out drawing on Nagel. So Nagel's moral luck argument specifically is that Moral luck is when you are held responsible for something that is beyond your control. Okay, so one of the big intuitive strengths behind the control account of luck is what's called the control condition for moral responsibility, which is to say, it doesn't seem good or it seems immoral to hold someone responsible for something that was beyond their control. That's a pretty much universally held moral intuition, generally speaking. And again, for every universally held intuition, there's a philosopher out there somewhere who's convinced themselves it's false. But very broadly, cross-culturally, the research suggests most people agree with the control condition for responsibility. And what Nagel does is he lays out a set of kinds of moral luck, the most important of which are constitutive luck and circumstantial luck, the luck of who you are and the luck of what you experience in your life. Those two kinds of luck together cover everything. You can include consequential luck as well if you like. It's just downstream of those two, though. At the end of the day, those two divide the world between them. There is nothing else besides constitutive and circumstantial luck. And you can do various regress arguments to prove that. And so we should abandon. Nagel doesn't go so far as to buy his own argument, but I do. We should abandon belief in free will, belief in moral responsibility, belief in deservingness, accept that everything is luck all the way down, teach that to children, and then teach them how to be better people because of it.
All right. Wow. So you really dashed towards summarizing all of this then.
Well, I mean, I can go into more detail on each of them. I just want to kind of like at each step of the way re-summarize so that people can keep track of why all of this has to be done.
Yeah, that's awesome. I wish I had the skill to do that. I start talking about something on my streams and then I realize I'm like 45 minutes in and I made 1 point and I just made it 16 different ways. So that's awesome. Yeah, so you hit us with a lot of different categories and ideas here, but the first thing that jumped out to me and the first thing I was starting to wonder is how does the moral luck literature relate to the free will literature? Because I would imagine you know, some people are just going to go, look, we have some type of like libertarian free will. Of course, that this is going to throw a wrench in the spokes of whatever you're trying to argue for here. And I could also imagine someone, framing this or looking at this from the perspective of how is this not just a sort of rehash of the whole free will debate? Like, are there, what are the differences here? How is this substantively
Mhm.
different from arguments about just general arguments about moral responsibility and the whole determinism, compatibilism type stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question for sure, and it's one that comes up a lot. And so there's a couple of ways we can answer that. We can answer philosophically, how is it different, psychologically, and also in terms of things like persuasion and discussion, how is it different? So one answer is just going to be, I think people respond when you use this different language differently than if you talk about free will directly. Um, that being said, free will and luck are two sides of the same argumentative coin. I'm not going to disagree with that because I do think they're essentially incompatible. Where there is luck, there is not free will because, and this is dipping into the psychology literature, ultimately free will judgments are rationalizations after the fact to justify punishment. This is what the current data, I think, best points to, is that there is a correlation between desire to punish and belief in free will, and that claims about belief in free will ultimately psychologically boil down to, I believe that this person needs to be punished and I don't want to feel bad about hurting them, and therefore I'm going to do so. There was a really good study that kind of, I think, makes a good case that the direction of causality, it goes that way, not the conventional wisdom, which is, I believe in free will, therefore this person deserves punishment. So I think it's an ad hoc rationalization, free will. And I think talking about luck undercuts it more effectively than just talking about free will. So I'm not just on about free will here. As I mentioned, I'm going after the whole fucking cluster of just world illusion stuff. And I think if you don't tie the free will to the just world illusion and show that it is a defender of unjust status quos, that's basically its function psychologically, and you don't tie it to these other things like divine justice and meritocracy, you don't make a sufficiently compelling case. I also tend to, as much as I humanly can, avoid discussions about determinism, indeterminism, physics, especially quantum physics. You mentioned libertarian free will. I think at the end of the day, if you're going to be a libertarian about free will, you're probably going to be something like, I think his name is Clark, who lays out a view that is basically you're an unmoved mover because quantum physics. And there's just really good reason to think that that's not how quantum physics works, that you are not an unmoved mover in this kind of way. So the only other option would be kind of compatibilist free will, something either like Dennett's elbow room or Mike Otsutka's what I call capacitarianism, where essentially it's saying, look, if you have the capacity to understand morality and enough autonomy to act on that capacity, or something, some sort of arrangement of abilities like that, then we're just going to treat you as if you're morally responsible. And that's where a lot of people get off the boat generally. That's where like a lot of people are a lot of the time, is that they just think that that's sufficient, that that's fine. And the reason I think that's bad is because it ignores the problem of moral luck. It ignores that your capacity to make choices, your capacity to work hard, your capacity to understand morality and not be a thoroughgoing sociopath, all the result of luck. Just luck all the way down. So if it's wrong to hold you responsible because of things that are luck, it's wrong to hold you responsible whether you have moral responsibility or whether you lack it. It would be particularly impossible to do so if you lack it, which leads to some weird asymmetries. I've had folks who defend compatibilism say, look, I'm not going to hold anybody morally responsible if they do something wrong because they lack the capacity in that context to do the right thing. But I am going to hold people morally responsible if they do something right. But that's like an impossible way to actually live. And like you can't enact that if it results in any kind of rewarding of people who do the right thing, because you're just going to create asymmetries that will effectively be kinds of punishment for those who did the wrong thing. So I throw out all that kind of stuff. I point out how free will is tied to deservingness, which is a huge problem. I talk about how I give a whole argument that goes beyond a lot of the traditional philosophical arguments against free will belief, which is I pull from a cluster of psychological theories like social dominance theory, system justification theory, authoritarianism, all of these analyses of like what went badly in the first half of the 1900s, to explain that like all of these illusions are legitimizing myths. Because for each of these illusions, there's a person out there who fully agrees with me that it's an illusion and has published that we should convince people that it's not an illusion, even though it is, because it would be better for them to believe that.
It would be better for them to believe. Sorry, maybe I got mixed up at the end there. Better for them
Yeah.
to believe the illusion.
Yeah, it'd be better for them like we should preserve our belief in free will, even though the arguments are overwhelming against it. That's
Yeah, and
Smolansky's view. I'm not mislabeling it. He literally says, "I'm going to argue for a noble lie approach to free will."
wow, okay. Yeah, and
Yeah,
I've heard people say stuff like if you convinced people they didn't have free will, we'd have to let everybody out of prison. We'd have to be okay
right,
with people
right.
just stabbing each other in the street. And I don't know why any of that would be true. And there's always something that puzzled me, this insistence that we need to preserve a sense that people have free will for the social benefits. So, I was never sold on compatibilism, despite it being the majority position among philosophers and being this like popular view just on the basis of the arguments, but the social consequences arguments, I never found those compelling. And I don't know what that's supposed to be predicated on other than misunderstandings about like the logical implications of, well, if you can't hold someone subject to this kind of responsibility in the kind of way that we think, uh, you can't do anything, as if there's no alternative that you could ratchet into that slot for,
Right.
here's a way to handle a person that's harming other people or doing bad stuff other than to get retributive. That's It's retributive or nothing. Why would it be that way? um yeah, I just
And like
that always struck me strange.
it is very strange, though not unsurprising, because like two of the major concerns that happen once you get past the philosophical counter arguments to this position, which are pretty weak, I would argue. A lot of both the philosophers and non-philosophers move on to the psychological concerns of fatalism and nihilism. You're
Mhm.
going to demotivate people, especially with regard to moral responsibility. Because I did just literally say moral responsibility isn't real. I do also, as we discussed on my other show, when we chatted earlier, believe that morality is real. It persists beyond the death of moral responsibility. We still have moral obligations. We're only lucky if we actually achieve them, is the only important caveat. But there is psychological data that I think is not very strong because of the way it has been gathered, but it is commonly cited that suggests there are some relationships between belief in free will and certain pro-social behaviors. I think that research is problematic. I think there's good reason to think that it is more likely that it is tied to what I would consider harmful antisocial behaviors because of the legitimizing myth research that I talked about. But a lot of the time, philosophers don't bother to cite that stuff. Smolansky doesn't cite Baumeister's research on free will belief as it relates to pro-social stuff. He just kind of hand waves at the idea that we can't have deontology if we don't have free will. Essentially, he's like, you can't respect people's autonomy. So one of the things I have to cover in this is that on a psychological level, the concept of autonomy or agency, which is valuable, which is, you're like, when you're not chained to a desk and forced to do something you don't want to do, you have a kind of autonomy that you don't have in that situation. Your life is better. You will flourish more if we do not enslave you. That's a good basic ethical and psychological principle, but that's completely separate from the free will concept. The free will belief in people's mind is about desire to punish, not about the kind of and like you see this in the research on self-determination theory and stuff like that, that like these concepts actually are separate and come apart. But you need to look at that research in order to inform your philosophical arguments. Otherwise, you might be like, well, these are synonyms, right? These are roughly the same thing. So if we deny free will, we must be denying autonomy or the value of autonomy entirely, which is not the case. Dennett's arguments are even worse. Elbow Room is a really famous book, and I don't quite understand why it got such a pass that it did. But in the final chapter, he argues that we have to preserve this idea for deterrence-based justice, not retributive, which is a separate flaw in his argument because like whatever you think about retributive justice, deterrence-based justice does not require belief in free will at all. Quite the opposite. If you don't believe in free will, you might be more inclined to a deterrence-based approach because you believe that you can control people's behavior through deterrence. So it's a very weird argument, but he also basically says we don't have a good test for when someone actually has free will or not. So we're going to kind of draw the line as best we can, and that's going to be worth it, and it's going to even out over time, and that's going to be good enough. So some innocent people are going to get punished, some aren't. It's fine. That's close enough. But as I point out in the third chapter, the legal system that arises from that principle is bad. It results in exactly what progressives are critical of, which is a system that downplays the role of systemic injustice and luck in criminal behavior and only treats really, really extreme cases like a tumor in your brain as being a case where you shouldn't be held responsible. Instead of, what you also mentioned there are alternatives, right? Restorative justice, as well as Greg Caruso's quarantine model, are both much better models for justice and are like thoroughly compatible with the luck-pilled model and cover everything that needs to be covered with nothing else left over. So a lot of what you're doing when you're doing this luck-pilled stuff is helping people see that they get to keep all of the things that are actually good for them and matter while still adopting this view, and they should abandon these things that they think are good for them but really aren't, like belief in free will.
Yeah, there's a couple angles I am interested in pursuing with this. So one of them would be, because there's a couple things I find interesting about your approach. A lot of times when people are making a philosophical argument, they remain firmly in this abstract theoretical territory, but you've integrated both the empirical literature and this sort of applied practical element to it, which is like, hey, we're trying to like it's you're coming at this from the angle. It looks to me like it's not like this top down approach where what's true and then let's act on it. It's hold on, what is it that we want to do, and now let's consider our philosophical perspectives in light of our goals and attitudes. Is that something that's motivating the way you're approaching this?
Yes, and this is very tricky. Contrary to what people might think, philosophers don't actually have a rule book for how to decide what the right definition is for something. We don't even have an agreement on what the right criteria are for a good definition. You can go one way with it and be like Socratic essential properties. You could have a pragmatic account of like what is a useful definition. Conceptual engineering debates get into a lot of different potential criteria, like, is this definition politically generative? Does it illuminate, political debates better than the alternative definitions? Is it easier to teach is another feature, right? Like, I think the modal account is really hard to teach. Luckily, we don't need it. At the end of the day, I don't actually take a position on what is the most important thing for a definition, because I'm lucky enough that I think the control account is best on all fronts. It beats the philosophical arguments better. So I was originally convinced of it because of a philosophical argument. And then I started to see the psychological implications, the political implications over time, and have used those to bolster it. So it isn't like I started from those and thought we have to, like, I would not adopt a noble lie approach if I didn't believe this was the case, because as I point out in the art in my dissertation, it's pedagogically immoral to lie to your students this way. Lying to your students about the nature of the world so that they will have slightly better test scores is bad. And I wouldn't do it even if it meant that we get to lie to them about the thing that I personally believe. Because at the end of the day, I think illusions are bad for people. Like, even ones that we perceive as being positive illusions are actually bad for people, and you're better off without them. So, fundamentally, I'm motivated by the truth, but I'm also motivated by the fact that pushing for the truth promotes a much more ethical society.
Yeah, so I'm on the same page with that. In fact, somebody just today asked me, like, "Hey, if it turned out teaching people," because our previous discussion was moral realism and anti-realism. I'm not going to rehash all that, but they asked me if belief in moral realism had all these salutary effects on people's behavior, would you endorse teaching it to people? And my initial response was, "Well, yeah, I'm not going to endorse a view that I think causes this calamitous collapse of society, but there is a trade-off there. It would have to be quite extraordinary how beneficial it was for me to say
Right.
it'd be worth it for me to favor teaching people things that I don't think are true. I mean, part of it would be, what about when they find out that it's not true? There's that. But then
Yep.
there's also just, you know, I am operating, and maybe this is a faith-based position, but I operate on the assumption that all the truths out there in the world to discover hang together and are coherent. And if you started teaching people sort of locally something that you consider to be a lie, I mean, what it might turn out to be true, which case, fortunate, you're lucky. But if you think it's false and it is false, it's not going to
Hmm.
synchronize well with the rest of a person's beliefs and attitudes, and that's
Correct.
going to cause problems, even if they're not obvious. And so, the benefits like if someone says, "Look, if you start teaching people more relativism, society will collapse and humanity will go extinct." Okay, maybe we gotta we got to wrap it up and not talk about it. The same thing with determinism, but that's a tough empirical case to make. And
Right.
I often have the impression that the people that are raising the alarm about this or that socially catastrophic consequence of our philosophical views haven't done any of the legwork to show substantive and compelling evidence that we have any particular cause for concern.
Yeah, and I pretty much argue all of their causes for concern are better applied to the just world illusion cluster. So my case for the fact that these are legitimizing myths is that not only do these illusions hang together, but they correlate strongly with conservatism, status quo bias, bigotry. Like, there's a article where a combination of these features is like predictive of the majority of not bigoted, prejudiced behavior, essentially, or beliefs. Like, these are the ideas driving prejudice, and they are the ideas that are driving I would argue many of the problems we're experiencing in our society. I don't know if our society is on the brink of collapse, but I think radical wealth inequality is going to be an interesting way to find out. Like, I think we're seeing over and over again that the existence of billionaires and radical wealth inequality, as all of the data explains, is destabilizing to societies, and all of it is downstream of this just world illusion stuff. The reason that Musk has billions of dollars is because he will believe that he deserves to have billions of dollars.
Yeah, so that's I'm really interested in that research, but you had also mentioned the behavioral research on free will. I would be
Mhm.
curious to see what your take is on either of those literatures. Maybe dealing with the second one first would make more sense, because I think it ends up not being as relevant to making your case, right? Like the free will stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the tricky thing about the free will literature is the main instrument that is traditionally has been primarily used for assessing free will belief has significant problems. It uses items that specifically talk about retributive justice in a way that, if free will really just is retributive justice, has a kind of double weighting problem. So the correlations may be problematic. There's a new instrument that people have put out that I think is better. But the research, the research has to sort of slowly catch up. But essentially, there's been, I would argue, a bit of replication problem when it comes to a lot of the claims about, this being associated with pro-social behavior, but also some weird complications about to what degree is it associated with conservatism. There is good evidence, I think, that just world illusion, free will belief, and conservatism hang together pretty strongly. And that they are then tied to things like strong beliefs in deservingness, which is tied to policy beliefs like poor people should not get benefits because they deserve to be poor because they chose to be poor. So there's a bunch of implications there. Other stuff in the free will literature that's really like one thing I think is important to note that you mentioned earlier, there's no strong impact, right? There's no impacts are so significant and clear that we should adopt a noble lie approach, right? Like much of positive, like I argue that all of the impacts of these different illusions follow a similar pattern. It's a very small benefit and actually a very significant hidden psychological cost that just isn't being measured. Plus, the positive benefits may be the result of other factors. The just world illusion, for example, there's a person who she doesn't believe. Well, so no, she calls it a positive illusion, and she thinks that we don't have to do the noble lie approach because it's so hardwired that it's not going anywhere. We don't even have to advocate for it. But her argument for the just world illusion is it provides benefits to students to believe that the world is just because they will work harder and think that they're going to get better outcomes if they believe that the world will treat them fairly in this way. Um, what her own data actually shows is the benefit accrues to privileged individuals and not marginalized ones. Marginalized individuals do not benefit from internalizing these ideas because what they ultimately have to internalize is that they are the only ones responsible for their own failures, which demotivates their demanding social justice and increases their belief that they are bad and deserve to suffer worse lives because of it.
Yeah, so that seems like a clearly negative consequence, especially if marginalized people outnumber privileged people. You get a benefit to
Right.
a few people. But yeah, the one of the things I immediately thought was, even if you didn't have data on the negative impact on individuals, you can have an effect that sort of locally for each individual has these detectable benefits, but for a population to have a particular attitude, it would be bad
Hmm.
for the long-term progress of that society. So like you could
Hmm.
have a society where you teach each individual you're super special, and so it makes them all feel better and they do better on some local task. But then I don't know, they become all narcissistic and arrogant and they're bad at self-correction, and the society as a whole like reduces its innovation, its ability to change. People become intransigent and they stagnate, and so the
Yeah.
local benefits can get swamped out at a population. And the methods that we typically use in psychological research are not going to readily pick up on that. A lot of these sort of
Right.
statistical studies that we use, like stuff that you determine at the population level can't be used to make predictions at the individual level, and stuff at the individual level isn't necessarily going to be particularly insightful for population level comparison. So a lot of times I think part of the issue is the way in which we interpret data. Some stuff
Right.
pops out from our data and we tend to focus on that and fail to recognize the significant possibility of all these things that we're failing to pick up on that are all also
Mhm.
relevant, and we're just not measuring them.
Yeah, I argue in the pedagogy chapter that meritocratic pedagogy has created kind of a tragedy of the commons, similar to what you're saying, at every level of education. That like teachers, students, parents, administrators are all being ground under in a world generated by the kind of meritocratic clawing approach to advancement, essentially. And that approach, may be beneficial to the tiny minority of elite individuals who benefit from it, but it has a really negative impact on everyone else. The overemphasis on effort we can see leading to workaholism, to burnout, to depression. And the thing is, while the harms are lesser for higher privileged individuals for various reasons, they're not non-existent. Markovitz's meritocracy trap is excellent for explaining how high status elite workers in meritocracies also have shitty non-flourishing lives because they are forced to be in these precarious 70-hour a week, compulsively work yourself to exhaustion jobs in order to maintain the status of living that they think is going to be associated with having merit.
It's kind of lose lose for everybody. Yeah, the other thing that always puzzled me about the disparities that could be generated by these type of luck considerations. A person in some initial condition of privilege can that snowballs and they get way more wealth. Uh, if they don't show a concern for the society that they're living in, what is like if they want to live inside behind thick walls and just they can't go outside because of the rest of the world is a threat to them? How is that going to? Why would they want to create a society where nothing works and everybody else is miserable? I wouldn't want to live in a society like that. I would want to live in a society where other people are well off because like even if I was taking a purely selfish attitude, I would want everyone else to be well off because those are the kinds of people I want to interact with. So there's
Yeah.
something deeply puzzling about this idea that like the benefits are zero sum and I should benefit at the expense of everyone around me. That's not the kind. Why would I want to live in a world like that? It's
Yeah,
weird.
one of the weirdest things that like has stuck with me and I've become a little fixated on wrapping up the dissertation, in the pedagogy section I talk about cultural references, ways that you can help people understand this by citing popular culture in different ways. And what I point to is what is arguably maybe the most popular and certainly one of the most performed pieces of art of all time, which is A Christmas Carol, which everybody like professes to love as far as I can tell. There aren't a lot of like Christmas Carol like detractors out there in the world, I feel like. And I feel like everybody very clearly understands that when Scrooge says, let them die and decrease the surplus population, he's the baddie. And yet, like, as you're saying, there seem to be people whose real desire is to just be Scrooge, like to just straight up claw all that wealth and hold on to it and live in a miserable, empty life in an empty world where everyone around you is miserable because you've extracted all the wealth you possibly can get away with extracting from them. I don't like, I wouldn't want to live that life either. And that's why I'm glad that like Scrooge turns it around. And why I'm baffled that I guess because of the like religious nature of it, or there's something about Christmas Carol where everybody once a year remembers this idea and then it's just poof gone. Like it just
Yep.
vanishes because it's not Christmas time anymore. So fuck everybody again, I guess. I don't know. But it's a very weird cultural touchstone to me that people take their children to this, but I'm the one indoctrinating them into luck pilling. Like he is indoctrinated by three belligerent, well, five to seven belligerent spirits, depending on your definitions, right? All of which are like mostly communist. But yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff out there that people like because they are partly aware of this reality, and it's just about helping them get through the existential crisis that Scrooge goes through of like getting all the way there. And then, like, my hope, one day I would love to luck pill, a millionaire or a billionaire and convince them. Like, I do think there are a lot of folks out there who are quite wealthy who do know that it's the result of luck and are
Mhm.
just looking for this framework to help them understand their moral obligations better.
Yeah, so I had a couple questions I wanted to ask that I'll just have to ask another time. Maybe I could ask them
So
quickly.
sorry.
Okay, let's see if we
Okay,
can do it quick.
quickly.
So I
Lightning
have a
round.
quick question, and then the last thing I want to wrap up on is just asking you like how this luck pilling process works, like what you do,
Okay.
because if you've done this with people before, I'd like people to get a sense of how that works. But the other question I wanted to ask is a lot of the stuff that you're bringing up, like the status quo bias system justification. I'm assuming some of these characteristics would be general or universal characteristics of human psychology that would crop up everywhere in a bunch of different cultures. But some of these seem like they might have a distinctive manifestation characteristic of Western culture or
Mhm,
capitalist
mhm, mhm.
societies or something like that. Or individualist societies. I'm sure there's a variety of economic, cultural, and like sociopolitical characteristics that could sort of add an extra spin to them. So I was wondering if you had looked into that at all, because you looked into this empirical research. How much of this like free will stuff and
Mhm.
the moral luck stuff, like a lot of the stuff you mentioned, sounds a lot like it would be stuff that would be particularly appealing to people from especially individualist cultures. So I was wondering if there's any sort of like cultural angle that had occurred to you or that you thought about on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I surveyed the psych literature on luck, a lot of it is about superstitious luck, which we haven't even talked about. This has all been non-superstitious luck, and a lot of there's a good chunk of it that is cross-cultural, and with the free will stuff, there is some as well to a slightly lesser degree, I think, but there is some of that as well. And a broad summary would be yes, yes, what you're saying is mostly the case, that there is variation while also being some universality. So, universally, human beings believe in superstitious luck, and have, like, weird behaviors, like they want to be friends with people who they think are lucky. Um, Universally, but, like, then what you see is, interestingly, more communal cultures might have more of a communal understanding of both luck and responsibility. So, related to the free will stuff is the moral responsibility stuff. Those cultures might view the individual not as being the locus of free will and responsibility, but as the community as being such. Then I think there's also good reason to think, though I don't think the evidence is overwhelming from what I'd read at this point, that your weird cultures, your Western educated, etc. cultures, because of their emphasis on individualism and certain kinds of Enlightenment thinking and a variety of other things like the Protestant work ethic being really dominant here, are more likely to be more inclined to some extent to believe in free will in the kinds of harmful ways that I'm talking about. Um, but I do think that, like, the control condition, for example, does appear to be pretty robustly cross-culturally universal. Um, yeah.
Cool. All right. So the last thing I wanted to ask you about is just, but you're not just arguing for a view, like there's, potentially, the benefits to people adopting this sort of view. So I'm wondering what that looks like how what your strategy or approach is to luck pill people.
Yeah. So I've broken this down into 5 steps. They are sometimes sequential, but not necessarily, like the stages of grief. Um, Getting woke about luck pervasiveness, which is just convincing people that everything is luck all the way down. I give a bunch of different methods for doing that, some of which I've talked about here, cultural references. There's a regress argument that I lay out where I think you can pretty well convince someone that everything is luck more effectively by giving them a chance to talk about an event in their lives, asking them why they did it, what features of them made that reason dominate their behavior over another reason, and then apply the like why regress question until they acknowledge that it's something beyond their control. Rinse and repeat until someone doesn't want to have the conversation anymore, and you've probably chipped away at their belief about things being separate from luck to some extent. Then you have addressing counterexamples, which are generally in the wider population going to be hard work and choice. Those are the two things that'll come up the most often. So you have to explain how hard work and choice are both luck. They're both the result of luck in a million different ways. Then you get to the navigating concerns like nihilism and fatalism, and you help people understand that the things that are valuable and that matter still matter, even if you are lucky enough to get to experience them or lucky enough to understand why they matter. Um, Finally, accepting unpalatable conclusions. You have to accept things like nobody deserves to suffer, not even Hitler, which is a hard pill for some folks to swallow. So doing, mindfulness kind of practices to work on that. And that brings me to the last part, which is reinforcing the positive effects of this approach. In the pedagogy chapter, tie luck pilling to 3 forms of progressive pedagogy that are already well established and have good research backing them up, which are mindfulness, social emotional learning, and social justice pedagogy. Just briefly, I'll talk about mindfulness, since that's I believe that luck pilling is a mindfulness practice. That's my tradition that I come out of, so it's the one I feel the most comfortable talking about a lot of the time. But what I get into in real detail is the research on compassion, empathy, gratitude, and humility, and intrinsic motivation and flow states, all of which are tied to mindfulness and all of which I think are incredibly benefited by luck pilling, particularly humility, where we don't have a lot of direct humility interventions to promote humility. And I think luck pilling is a really good direct intervention that doesn't trigger people in various ways.
Yeah, this should give some of that humility training to philosophers more frequently,
I mean,
perhaps.
business folks, like management and business world, is very big on the idea of humility and that narcissism is bad for management. So I think there's a lot of really good uses for this in various spaces where people are trying to promote those virtues.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I'm gonna have to wrap it up there. So,
Okay.
the last thing I'll just ask you is, where can people find your work and what you work on? Like, what do you want to tell people about if they want to check out more of your stuff?
Sure. So I'm the ethics director at the Creator Accountability Network. That's my current home at the moment, as well as wrapping up this dissertation stuff at Rutgers. You can find my work at my podcasts are Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space. They're on all the major apps. If you would like a copy of the dissertation and want to read all 200 pages, you can email me at voidpod@gmail.com or hit me up on Blue Sky at ETVpod on there. I have a somewhat regular article at the UK Skeptic Mag, not the Michael Shermer one. That I think that's the main places these days.
Cool. All right. Thanks so much for being here. I'm sorry to cut our conversation short. Just, stuff has to
No
happen.
problem.
Thanks so much for being here. I hope we get to have another conversation because I feel like I do these like 5 hour stream, oh, not 5 hours, like 3 or 4 hour streams. Don't let me get hyperbolic when people could check the numbers.
Mhm.
I'm used to having these conversations that are really stretched out, and I feel like I kind of dashed through this one, and I have so many questions and so much more that I think we could talk about. So, if you're up for it, we should have another conversation another time.
Yeah, absolutely. And if folks have questions, happy to answer some of those on the show. I dashed through it because I knew you were a little short on time too, but I'm happy to unpack all of this to everyone's heart's content.
Yeah, cool. No, but this probably worked out to be a good thing because people get
Hmm.
a general sense of everything out there without
Yeah.
getting lost in the weeds too much. So that could be something for follow ups. All right, thanks so much, and everybody, please. I'll send links to your stuff. I'll put them in the description. But like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. Do all that regular stuff. And now it's time for outro video. So see you all later.